The thistle patch looked harmless in dawn's forgiving light, all purple crowns and silver down. I should have known better. In the borderland between our village fields and the moonlit forest, beauty often hides a bite. My hem snagged first, then my skin. A dozen barbed threads slid under the surface of my wrist, tasting blood the way a needle tastes cloth. I tried to pull free and the thorns tightened, drinking something that was not blood at all. "Do not speak your name," a voice warned from the trees. The bramble listens. I stilled, breath shallow. Morning mist peeled away from a figure stepping out of the birches, tall, light on the earth, armor like pale leaves overlapping. A circlet sat on his brow. The air around him smelled of rain after a long drought. Elf, worse, an elf of rank. When he glanced at the snagged threads in my wrist, gold flared in his eyes in a way that wasn't human. "The oath-thistle has you," he said, kneeling. "It will claim what it can. If it takes your true name, it will bind you to this ground until the next new moon, or bleed you dry before then. My name is—" I bit the word in half. My mother had taught me the old warnings. Never pour your true name into wild ground, and never offer it to the fair folk. "I'm Elowen," I choked out with the smallest lie I could manage. Elowen Greyweave, daughter of a seamstress, a human name among human fields. I swallowed the older syllables that slept like embers under my tongue. He looked at me as if he could see the unsaid name glowing there. "You are stubborn, Elowen," he murmured. "That may save you, or doom you. Hold still." From his belt he drew a knife that wasn't metal so much as moonlight hammered thin. He touched its edge to the bramble, and the thistle sang. Not prettily. It hissed like dry laughter in a temple. The barbs sank deeper, trying to anchor, trying to claim. Pain shot up my arm to my shoulder, and then flooded my throat. I couldn't scream. The thistle wanted that sound too. "Look at me," he said, and I did, because something in his voice offered a tether when everything else was slipping. "Breathe when I say 3. He moved like light moves through leaves, quick, silent, exact. On one breath he cut the first thread, and it recoiled with a wet snap. On the next, he carved a sigil in the dirt with his free hand. 3 strokes, a curve, a point, and the thistle hissed again as if the ground itself had grown a spine. By the third breath, my vision was turning white at the edges. He caught my chin in his gloved fingers, forced my gaze to his. "Stay," he ordered softly, and for a heartbeat the command felt like a warm hand on the back of my neck, steadying me in a storm. He severed the last thread. The thistle screamed. A high wire pulled too tight, and all at once I was free, staggering into him. His arm came around me with the instinct of someone who had caught many falling things. Up close I saw the truth of him. Not just elf, but crowned with responsibility. A dozen oaths braided into his posture. "Thank you," I whispered. He winced. "Do not thank me yet." That was when I saw the welt blooming across his palm, where the thistle juice had touched him through the glove. The mark was the color of dusk, and it pulsed to a rhythm that did not belong to either of us. "It takes a debt," he said, wrapping a strip of cloth around the wound. "The oath-thistle is old magic. To save you, I bought its attention. It will follow the one who cut its feast short unless we set the terms." Cold slid down my back like a spilled bucket of river water. "What terms?" He met my eyes, and I understood what I had not wanted to admit. This was not just any elf. The forest bent toward him without moving. Birds had stopped singing when he stepped into the clearing, and resumed now in wary trills. Only one kind of creature made the world hold its breath like that. "I am Kaelin of Moonthorn," he said. "Prince of the Eastern Bow. The bramble recognizes my authority, but it demands balance. Hear me before you fear me, Elowen. Greyweave, there is a vow between us now, by law older than my house and your village both. I did not swear anything," I said, anger waking because it was easier than the weakness in my knees. "You bled on the thistle," he answered, quiet as winter. "And I bled for you. The law calls that an exchange. Without a vow to name and limit the bond, the bramble will write its own, a crueler one. It would take your feet to root and your tongue to silence, and it would take me piece by piece each time I passed this field. Better a cord you can hold than a net you cannot see." Fear prickled my scalp. My mother's voice rose in memory. "Choose the narrower road when both lead into fog. What does your cord require?" 3 dawns only," he said, as if arguing with someone I couldn't see. "You will come under my protection for 3 dawns, witness something the court must know, and speak a single truth there. After that, I will cut the pledge with the same blade, and you will walk free of me and of the thistle both. No bed of mine, no leash of mine, no claim on your name, only a vow to mark the path from this morning to the 3rd. He said it like a ritual he didn't like, and didn't expect me to like either. I listened past his words to the forest. The thistle had stopped singing, but a silence hung around the clearing, the silence of a cat poised behind a door. I could leave, run back to the village, wrap my wrist in nettle poultice and forget his face. The bramble would not forget mine. 3 dawns, I said, making myself sound like a woman who wasn't shaking. And then you cut me free. He nodded once. On my name. Swear it on more than that, I said, before I realized I was speaking to a prince as if he were a boy bargaining for apples. Swear it on whatever anchors. Princes. Something almost like a smile touched his mouth. On the bough that bears my house, and the star that marks my line, he said, and the air tightened for a heartbeat, as if the world had nodded. He held out his uninjured hand, palm up. A thin silver thread of light spun between us, shimmering into being from nowhere, humming a note I felt in my bones. I knew the shape of that magic the way a seamstress knows the pull of good thread, taut, even, designed to hold. Say only this, he instructed softly. I accept the Moonthorn witness-vow for 3 dawns. I looked at the thread, at the welt on his palm, at the thistle's purple heads shivering although there was no wind. I thought of my mother's warnings, and of the way he had said stay when everything inside me was coming apart. Then I thought of my life if I refused, a field I could no longer cross, a forest that would never again feel safe, a future snagging on barbs until it bled out. I accept the Moonthorn witness-vow for 3 dawns, I said, carefully, each word set like a stitch. The thread leaped to my wrist, cold, then warm, then perfectly the temperature of my skin. It sank just beneath the surface, silver showing and dimming as my pulse slid under it. His eyes flashed, not triumph but relief, a prince who had steered a carriage along the edge of a ravine without tipping it. It is done, he said. Elowen, there is one more truth you should have before we leave. What truth? The thing I need you to witness. He glanced past my shoulder, toward the deeper wood where the shadows wore their own shadows. The thistles are blooming in winter, and someone is feeding them names. My mouth went dry. Whose names? Human ones, he answered, and some I fear I already know. If you want me to continue this story, drop a comment with continue and tell me your favorite moment so far. Don't forget to subscribe. Your support helps me bring the next part faster. The silver thread beneath my skin warmed when we stepped back under the birches, as if to say, kept promise, keep moving. Kalen pressed his palm over the welt where the thistle had kissed him, then ground a pinch of pale ash into the dirt where my blood had fallen. The ash smelled like rain and bitter herbs. What is that? I asked, flexing my sore wrist. The barbs had left crescent bruises like tiny moons. Salted rowan, he said. It sours the ground for hungry roots. He straightened, gaze turning to the darker belt of forest beyond the field. We cannot linger. Winter thistles do not bloom alone. I followed, because the thread tugged, and because I did not know how to stop thinking about the words he had spoken. Someone is, feeding them names. In our village, names are counted like coin at first frost. Births written on scrap, deaths read at the well, a year knotted and put away. I had never considered that names might be traded like apples over a barrel. We crossed a line of old boundary stones, each carved with a shallow leaf mark I recognized from my mother's stories. Fair borders, they were called, places where bargains hold fast because everyone is watching, even the moss. The air cooled 2 degrees on the far side, and the birds went quiet as if we had walked into a listening room. Say nothing you would not want repeated, Kalen murmured. Here, echoes have good memories. Then answer something I keep swallowing, I said, surprising both of us with how steady my voice sounded. Why me? A prince could have cut any human free this morning and named any witness. His mouth ticked at one corner. The vow narrows what I may say, but this truth is safe. You were not any human to the thistle. It reached for you like a hook finding an old wound. That means a thread was already laid between your life and the thing I am hunting. He glanced at me, assessing, not unkind. Do you dream of gardens with no doors? Yes, I said before I could think to keep it. A seamstress's daughter dreams of cloth, of doors too, and dresses, and coins. But that garden had haunted me since childhood. Thorn walls, a single gate, my name folded into the hinge. The thistle blooms in those dreams first, he said. Someone taught it which way your sleep turns. I wanted to deny it. The silver under my skin hummed once, low, a reminder of the rules we had agreed to walk inside. We came to a place where the ground rose and split into a low ridge. Bramble threaded the crest, black-green against the pale frost. But these blooms were wrong even to my untrained eye. The purple ran toward blue at the edges, and the stamens glinted like wire. From a distance, the patch looked like script. "Do not step on the shadow of the stems," Kaelin said quietly. "They will take shadow for foot if they can." I picked my way to his side, towing only bare dirt. Up close, the script resolved. The thistle heads bent into letters. The stems twined into lines. I did not need to. Read the fair tongue to know the shape of a list when I saw one. "What are they spelling?" I whispered. "Invitations," he said. "Names offered in exchange for favors. Harvest without blight. Fewer wolves at lambing. A child's fever taken down for one night. Petitions paid with the only currency the thistle respects. Human names." I counted 3 spelled in the coarse block of our village script, knotted crudely into the finer lines of fare. Letters: Laura, Pieter, Hannah. None were strangers. A cold ache opened at the base of my throat. A sound rose under the ridge like wind worrying a fence, but there was no wind. The bramble shifted. A figure ratcheted out of the hedge as if unhooking itself from its own hooks. A man-shape formed of stems and husks, foxglove bells where eyes should be, a jaw hinged with thorn. It wore a scrap of something over one wrist, caught on a barb. I knew the pattern at a glance, the little swallow my mother stitched into every hem she made. "Back," Kaelin said, stepping between me and the thing. He did not draw his knife right away. Instead, he lifted his wounded hand and traced 2 swift arcs in the air. The arcs hung, like pale threads strung from nothing, curving around me and fastening to the ridge. I felt them settle against my skin, taut and precise. A tailor's chalk line laid before the scissors. "Cut. Speak no names," he added, too quietly for the bramble to steal the shape of the words. The thorn-made thing jerked its head toward me. When it spoke, it used my father's voice from the year he died, hoarse and kind and tired. "Elowen, you left your needle in the doorframe again." My knees loosened. "That's not him," Kaelin finished for me. Hollow-mouthed thieves learn quickly which voices open the latch. The thing raked. Thorn fingers across its chest. Letters spilled from the wounds. Hannah, Pieter, Laura, petitions cashed, promises kept badly. The blue-purple halos of the blooms brightened, scent turning metallic. "Who fed you?" Kaelin asked, voice flattening. "Say the broker's title." It clicked its jaw and offered a laugh that made my molars ache. "Titles. They change like leaves, but the one who brings us ripened names wears ink on his fingers and writes with both hands." Ink on his fingers. Writes with both hands. My stomach fell. The scribe who kept our winter lists, who recorded births and deaths and debts, was ambidextrous. Aldrin. He had smiled at me last week as he counted thread spools for tax. Ink smudged along his thumb where he had worried at a stain. I did not say his name. I was not sure whether I would speak it or spit it. The thing lunged. Kaelin's knife was moonlight again, and this time, he did not move like leaves. He moved like the shadow of a hawk crossing a field, swift and startling, making everything else look slow. He cut for joints that did not exist until his blade found them, unseaming the creature along lines it hadn't known it had. Thorns shrieked. The sound climbed the spine of the air. "Stay in the circle," he said, without looking back. "The vow will tighten if you step out." It already had. The silver in my wrist pulled snug as a seam through tight cloth. I could feel the shape of its tether line up with the chalk arc threads he had cast. His protections mapped to our promise, both holding me where he needed me to be. He could not command me with a spell, the vow had said as much, but he could make the safest place the one he asked me to stand in. The white, it was no tree now. It was something wearing the idea of a man, swung a hooked arm toward Kaelin's wounded hand. He turned the blade and took the hit on his vambrace, hissed when a barb found flesh near the strap. The welt from before flared, dusk purple deepening to bruise black. "Kaelin," I said, and the vow warmed as if approving the use of his name. "Do you have shears?" he asked through his teeth. I blinked, stupid for a beat, then remembered the small iron scissors every seamstress's daughter carries without thinking, tied inside my sleeve for mending on the run. I pulled them free. They looked like toys in my palm, 2 dull leaves hinged together. "Iron offends it," he said quickly, "but not enough. Aim for what looks like thread." I looked. Amid the chaos of stem and spine, I saw the thing's center. Not heart, exactly, but a cord, braided of hair and twine and, oh saints, a strip of blue cloth with a swallow embroidered near the edge. My mother's mark, stitched into a ribbon. My fingers went cold. "Cut the ribbon," Kaelin said, seeing it too. "Do not touch the braid itself." The white lunged again. Kalen caught its arm and drove his knife into a place that was not a shoulder until it became one, pinning the creature for a single breath. I darted in that breath, the vow tugging but not stopping me when my path matched its geometry. The shears met the blue ribbon and bit. The sound that came out of the white was not a scream. It was a sigh of relief so deep it vacuumed the breath from my lungs. The blooms along its spine wilted at once, purple draining to gray. It sagged in Kalen's grip and then slid apart, stem from stem, thorn from thorn, until nothing remained but a drift of dried husks and a stink like old rain in a granary. I had the ribbon in my fist. The swallow my mother stitched was smudged with something darker than dirt. Inside the fold of blue, hidden where the seam ran, lay a scrap of parchment. I teased it out with shaking nails, fair letters inked fine as hairs. Beneath them, in crooked human hand, a single line, a low and gray weave, held for third dawn. My mouth went dry. The ribbon shook between my fingers. I did not give this, I said. I never would. I believe you, Kalen said, too gently. He touched the welt on his palm, as if it ached in time with my pulse, which means someone who could reach your mother's workbox, and your winter list is dealing names in the dark, and they have planned the time of your binding to match ours. The vow thread under my skin thrummed, high and dangerous, like a string drawn too tight. Somewhere deeper in the wood, other brambles answered, a choir of quiet needles tuning for a song. Whoever wrote this, I managed, already knows I am walking with you. They do, he said, and they know where we will be at dawn. He lifted his head, listening to the forest's breath. We need to change the road before the road is changed for us. We did not take the road that led straight. Kalen turned us toward a corridor of ash trees that grew too evenly to be wild, their trunks pale as the inside of an oyster shell. Underleaf, he said, a path the maps forget. He unfastened the crescent clasp at his throat and turned his cloak inside out. The lining shimmered dull, like velvet rubbed backward. Walk close. Underleaf takes a tithe from those who wander. What kind of tithe? I asked, touching the ribbon in my pocket, as if I could keep its swallow from flying out. Certainties, he said. A memory of which door you used. A conviction about what you meant. If it asks for your name, answer with a color. Cobalt, I said, before fear could answer for me. His glance was brief, approving. Hold to it. The ash corridor dimmed though the day was climbing, and the air smelled of starch and rain. Leaves layered overhead in a weave that made sky into fabric. I understood why he'd chosen the path the moment we entered it. Sound behaved differently here. Our footfalls landed soft and did not travel far. Whatever watched the border fields would hear two people vanish and not know where they had gone. The silver thread under my skin tugged, then softened, adjusting to the corridor's geometry. I imagined it like a stitch anchoring a seam to new grain. Kalen noticed the way my fingers hovered near the mark. It is listening to you, he said. You don't need to pull it to make it follow. I sew because thread obeys, I said. Magic that behaves like thread feels like a trap I might manage. Trap it is, he said, but one with a door. We walked until the ash trunks opened like curtains onto a hollow ringed by low stones. A longhouse stood at the center, roof thatched with reeds, walls woven of wattle gone silver gray. The place smelled faintly of beeswax and old smoke. The Weaver's Hall, Kalen said. Human-built, elf-blessed. Neutral once. Once, I echoed, running fingers over a carved lintel. Swallows, nets, and a simple needle laid alongside a leaf. My mother taught here sometimes in summer, showing girls to cut gussets so sleeves fit, or to strengthen a hem with a hidden stitch. I had played on these stones. I had watched the light move across the packed dirt, and wondered if it made a pattern I could learn. Why here? I asked. Because vows were cut here, he said. Not broken, cut, cleanly, with care. If I am to change the road, I must do it where the road has learned to change. He knelt near the threshold stones, and unpacked a small bundle. Salt, rowan ash, a shard of smoked glass. I unrolled my own kit by instinct. Iron needle, beeswaxed thread, thimble, shears. The iron felt heavier here, as if the hall respected it. How do we change a vow without breaking it? I asked. Not by wrenching, he said. By adding a hem. His mouth curved. Not quite a smile. You named it yourself. He set the smoked glass where the door's shadow fell and breathed across it. A fog bloomed. Inside the shard, a tiny dawn trapped in a stain. He drew the blade of his moonlight knife across his own palm, letting one drop strike the glass. The fog steadied. The glass glowed faintly. He turned to me. Your turn. I did not want to bleed again for this morning, but the ribbon in my pocket said I would whether I wished or no. I pricked my finger with my needle and let a single bead fall to the glass beside his. It struck and rippled like rain. The silver under my skin warmed, then cooled. Now, he said, voice careful, with your craft, lay a false hem, not a lie, a fold. We will not change the vows' words, only the way the world reads them. It says third dawn. We will make dawn arrive early where we choose. Can that be done? Dawn walks differently over hills than it does on plains, he said. Light is obedient to shape. We give the vow a shape it understands. He traced a DI'd circle in ash and salt, setting the glass shard in its heart. I will anchor the edges. You sew the fold, I finished, because the understanding arrived in my hands before it reached my head. I waxed the thread, not thinking about how absurd it was to sit with a prince in a forgotten hall and prepare to hem light. The wax smell steadied me. I threaded the needle and, without being told, dipped it once in the rowan ash. Begin on the side you fear least, Kaelin said quietly. I had always begun at the right corner. Today I began at the left, because someone who wrote with both hands and ink on his fingers had seen my right-handed habits 1,000 times. I pushed the needle through the empty air above the glass, and the air took it. A bright stitch appeared, silver like the thread under my skin, but softer, as if I were sewing with reflection. I made another, careful not to crowd, catching nothing, and yet catching something. The circle at my feet hummed. You are certain of your word? Kaelin asked, hands steady where he anchored the chalked perimeter. Cobalt? Cobalt, I said, and every time I pulled the needle through, I pictured that deep living blue at the heart of a good thread spool, where the dye settles true. I sewed across the top of the shard, then turned the work, then sewed along the lower edge. The stitches caught light like scales. Underleaf tested me once. The ash corridor whispered, Are you sure you began left? A memory unfurled of my mother's hands guiding mine. Always anchor on the right, Elowen, or your hem will drift. I breathed through it. Let the teasing slide off like a burr from oiled cloth. Cobalt, I said, and made the next stitch. The glass brightened. On its surface I saw a tiny horizon break. Light stroked the edge of a hill that was not the hill outside our doorstep. The dawn we were sowing belonged to the eastern cliffs above Moonthorn River, where the sun leaped early because rock surrendered first. Kaelin's eyes flicked to mine, pleased without words. Good, he said. Now close. I did, setting the last stitch exactly where the first began, knotting with a tailor's quick twist. The knot sank into the air like a bead into flour. The silver in my wrist flared, then settled, as if it had found a seat it liked better. I exhaled only then, realizing I had been holding my breath through the last 3 stitches. Done, I whispered. Not yet, another voice said from the doorway. Ink smelled different from smoke, oilier, skin warm. I knew that scent intimately. Nights spent untangling thread by candlelight while my mother wrote orders. Mornings when Aldrin the scribe stood by the well and read the winter lists, ink drying, shiny on his thumb. The man in the threshold wore a traveling cloak the color of water left too long in a bucket. His hair was neat, his hands clean except for the black crescent smears on his first 2 fingers, on both hands. A leather satchel rested against his hip like a tame animal, its flap pricked with tiny holes and patterns that made my seamstress's eye twitch in dismay and recognition. Code, stitch to be read by touch. Forgive the interruption, he said pleasantly. I knocked, but the door's courtesy seems to have taken a holiday Underleaf. His gaze slid over Kaelin's sigils, and then to the shimmer of my stitches. Neat work, Elowen Greyweave. Your mother would be proud. She was a tidy hand. I did not say his name. The vow hummed in warning. Kaelin rose in one smooth line that added a sword to his height without actually drawing it. Aldrin, Kaelin said, because princes can afford to pay the tithe of accuracy. You bring your book into a hall where books are not king. Aldrin, no use pretending otherwise, set the satchel down on the nearest stone as if placing bread on a table. My book goes where names are owed, he said, and there is a name in this room that owes itself. His eyes flicked to me, kind as a knife. Little Seamstress, do you remember the fold in your hidden name? The syllable you ironed flat, so you could pass through a human doorway without catching. Let me help you press it out again. It begins with... The first sound left his mouth like a soft thread pulled from the warp. The hall went cold enough to ache. The ribbon in my pocket jerked, swallowing light. The bramble beyond the ash corridor shivered such that the roof thatch sighed. Kaelin did not shout. He did something quieter and far more dangerous. He spoke over Aldrin with a counter name, a craft name, the title a master gives an apprentice when he wants her to be more than a pair of hands. Witness, he said, every letter placed like a stitch through leather. Moonthorn's chosen witness. Stand. The vow seized on the offered shape and swelled, a sail catching necessary wind. The syllable Aldrin had spun unraveled against it, fraying into harmless string that fell invisible to the floor. Aldrin sighed, and the disappointment in it was so gentle I wanted to hit him. Always the noble boy, he said to Kaelin, as if remembering something close and old. Always the right word when the strong word would do. He glanced at my glass again, thoughtful. A clever hem. Moving dawn buys you hours, perhaps a day, but you know you cannot cut the thread in this hall, Prince. That mercy belongs to the court. Kaelin stepped once, and the entire hall leaned toward him. Walk away, he said, while I still count you among the living. Aldrin's smile did not reach his eyes. He lifted 2 fingers. Thistle seeds drifted through the doorway like ash. Some had letters on their wings. 3 dawns, he reminded us. I am punctual. The seeds touched the threshold and burned into words I could read too easily. Elowin, 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 inked in 3 hands, each a different slant, as if my name had been borrowed and lent. Again. Kaelin, I whispered, because fear is loud, but a whispered name can be louder if you mean it. I see them, he said, and under my skin the silver thread tightened. Not a leash, a lifeline. Ready your needle, Elowin. If he writes, we unwrite. If he sews, we seam rip. You keep the fold true, and I will keep him from finishing a sentence. The first seed burst with a sound like a smirk. I set my needle to air and stitched. Ink fell like rain that had learned to spell. Every drifting seed cracked and unrolled into a filament of script, my name repeating in a dozen slants, each stroke barbed where the pen had lifted. I didn't stab at them. I did what Kaelin had told me, what my mother had drilled into me at a kitchen table worn smooth by years. I slid my needle under the first letter and lifted gently, the way you tease a bad stitch so the cloth won't pucker. The letter unmade itself, into harmless dots, ink snow that melted on the threshold. Aldrin watched, head tilted, as if I were a promising student taking an exam he had set. Backstitching identity, he murmured. How domestic. His eyes warmed. How effective. Kaelin didn't rise to the bait. He stepped just enough to put the line of his body between me and the satchel, palm open over the chalk circle he had drawn, eyes on Aldrin's hands instead of his smile. Underleaf. Hall keeps neutral until a guest stains the lintel, he said. You threw first ink. Go. Go? Aldrin's mouth curved. But I just arrived, and there is so much work to do before dawn. Yours and mine. The last word had weight. I felt the hall register it, a settling, as if a heavy book had been placed on a shelf that remembered its shape. Kaelin's jaw tightened. He lifted 2 fingers and pinched the air. The silver stitches I'd set glimmered, then brightened, as if they had inhaled. Hold, he told them, and the sewn horizon within the glass shard steadied. On its tiny edge, light gathered like breath before a song. Aldrin reached into his satchel and brought out a roll of parchment, bound with twine the color of old bone. He shook it once. The twine untied itself and slithered away like a lazy snake. He unrolled the parchment with more care than I had seen him use on anything that breathed. The letters on it were not letters. They were spines and seeds and hinge marks, an alphabet that wanted to bloom into needles. He laid the sheet on a stone and pressed both inked thumbs to the top corners. Shall we trade proofs? He asked pleasantly. You demonstrate that dawn can be moved by hem. How charming. And I demonstrate that names can be counted out like grain. Do not answer him, Kaelin said to me without looking away from Aldrin. Witnesses keep their weight by keeping their words. I kept seam-ripping the seeds as they burst on the lintel, my needle traveling faster now that my hands had learned the balance point. Lift, undo, smooth. Lift, undo, smooth. It felt like rescue and fury both. Rescue for myself, fury for the names I had already unspooled from the white's chest. Hannah, Pieter, Laura. Aldrin pressed his thumbs harder. The parchment bloomed. Letters thickened into thorn buds, then cracked. A new bramble unscrolled from the paper and flowed toward the floor like water poured from a bad dream. It reached for the chalk circle and stopped, tasting salt and rowan, unwilling to put itself where the ground argued back. Court blade, court ash, court stitch, Aldrin said, almost fond. You do everything by book, Kaelin, even your rebellion. Enough, Kaelin said, and now he did draw the moonlight knife. didn't fling it. He laid it across the air between us and Aldrin, and the hall made it into a bar of cold day, a bright lintel at shoulder height, a command the room was glad to obey. Underleaf liked doors. Kaelin had just made one where none had been, and he stood exactly where it would be strongest. Aldrin smiled again, smaller this time. "I taught you that trick," he said softly. "Do you remember?" Kaelin did not answer. His silence said yes. My needle paused, despite my own command of it. "You taught him?" Aldrin's gaze slid to me briefly, a flicker that was almost pity. He was not always a prince in practice, only in title. Ink can teach metal another kind of obedience, but lessons are only as faithful as the student. He glanced back at Kaelin. "You took what would have freed you and made it into a better cage." "Out," Kaelin said, and the bar of day between them brightened until my teeth ached. Aldrin sighed, as if bored with his own cleverness. He took his thumbs off the parchment. The half-born bramble withered at once, collapsing into curls of black like burnt hair. He rolled the sheet up neatly, retied it with the obedience it demanded, and slid it into the satchel with a pat. "Very well. I will meet you where all proper endings are signed and sealed." His chin lifted toward my stitched dawn. "At the cliffs, when the hem bites the horizon." He stepped backward into Underleaf's shadow and was gone. Not theatrically, the opposite. One heartbeat he was listening. The next, the air had forgotten the shape of his shoulders. Underleaf tithed something from me in that instant, an understanding of which plank in our kitchen floor creaked near the bread cupboard, as silly and sharp as a paper cut. I swore softly, more in grief than anger. Kaelin let the knife's light sink away, not sheathing it until the last line of brightness left the air. He didn't ask if I was all right. He looked at the glass, then at me, then at the doorway where Aldrin had been, and he said, "We go now." We didn't leave by the door. He kicked the hearthstones aside with the care of someone handling fragile cloth and pressed his palm to the packed earth beneath. It warmed, first the color of bread crust, then of iron taken from the coals. The floor dented inward on a line, then another, a rectangle rising like a trapdoor turned upside down. He gripped the edge and lifted. Cold breath wafted up, smelling of river and dock rope. "The selve edge," he said. "The edge path the hall keeps for when war forgets to knock." We climbed into darkness, gathered in a square. The hatch closed without sound. For a moment there was only the feel of my own pulse and the soft hum of the vow thread. Then I heard what the hall kept secret, a river running just beneath the world's fabric, fast and disciplined, a shuttle passing warp to weft. We stepped onto a plank that floated without touching water. It carried us. "How did you know him?" I asked when speech stopped feeling like a dropped stitch. Kaelin's answer was quiet and unadorned. "He studied in Moonthorn when I was small. The court had a theory. If the scribe who kept human names understood elf oaths, petty bargains would thin. We would speak better. We would share language. They brought him in summer and bowed to him in winter and sent him home with books and a temper sharpened to a point." A pause. "He taught me the door trick when I was 12 and would not stop running. And now he feeds Thistle with names. And now," Kaelin said, "he has decided that if the court will not bend, he will force it to its knees using the only lever that makes an elf flinch: debt." We drifted through a tunnel of woven root and old brick. At the end, the plank nudged a rung ladder. Kaelin went up first. I followed into air that tasted clean and high. We emerged into blue dark, the hour before morning when color thinks about returning. The Moonthorn River shone below us like hammered pewter, its gorge cut clean into the bones of the world. Eastward, the cliff face lifted the sky closer. "The hem will work here," I said, feeling the glass shards pulse in my pocket like a second heartbeat. "It will," he said, "but Aldrin will be waiting where light first breaks, and he will have more than seeds." He scanned the ridge and added, almost apologetically, "He knows my habits. He knows where I put my feet when I'm tired. We must not be that version of me." I swallowed a laugh that wanted to be a sob. "So we make a new habit in a hurry." "Exactly." He crouched and drew a line in frost with his knife's flat, then another to make a V pointed toward the river bend. "You sew the fold open when I say, not before. If you anchor too early, Dawn will trip over our hem and spill where we don't need it. And if I anchor too late, then Dawn will ignore our work, and the vow will bite at Aldrin's hour instead of ours." A band of gray woke along the far edge of the world. I thought of my mother's ribbon, the swallow she stitched into every hem, the scrap we had found inside with my name written, held for third dawn. I thought of the children's fevers Aldrin had promised to lower, the wolves he had promised to keep from lambing pens, the way desperation makes a door in your heart, that crooks its finger at any hand that promises warmth. "Kaelin," I said, and he looked up. "If I speak the truth at court," I asked, "whose truth hurts more, you or him?" "Truth always hurts the one who turned away from it first," he said, "but do not spare me if the cut is mine." The eastern rim brightened from slate to pearl. Far below, the river shouldered a rock and made a sound like cloth ripping in a tailor's shop. "Now," Kaelin said. I took the shard out and felt the stitches I had made become a pathlight wanted. The glass warmed in my hand. I set the needle and pulled the first new stitch through the morning. The hem caught, the horizon tilted, and dawn, obedient to shape, took one step toward us that it should not have been able to take. Somewhere on the far side of the gorge, a figure lifted a satchel and smiled. Dawn obeyed the hem. It stepped toward our cliff the way a well-taught hound steps to heel, alert, wary, ready to bolt if I gave the wrong tug. Light combed the frost-flat grass and turned every blade into a thin needle. The silver thread beneath my skin hummed, not with pain this time, but with alignment, like a note finally sung true. Across the gorge, a figure stood where the cliff bit the sky. Satchel, neat hair, inked thumbs. A curl of paper unspooled beside him and sailed in the updraft, not falling, just waiting, as if even gravity deferred to Aldrin when names were in the air. "Third dawn is not a minute on a clock," he called. Across the river, Underleaf stole echoes, but the heights returned them generously. "It is a meeting of light and intent. I have both." "Not anymore," Kaelin said. Low enough for me, but loud enough for the cliff to carry the promise. He angled his body between Aldrin and me, blade down, palm open. "Hold your stitches steady. If he writes, you unwrite. If he tries to speak your hidden syllable, breathe and let the vow carry the weight instead of your spine." Hidden syllable. The old ember glowed behind my teeth. I felt it more acutely as the horizon brightened, as if the light itself wanted to read my mouth. Aldrin lifted his left hand. Ink shone along his thumb. "We can do this civilly," he said. Not to me, but to Kaelin, as if the two of them were still trapped in a long-ago lesson only they remembered. "You bring your witness. I bring my ledger. We let the thistle adjudicate what the court refuses to see, that the realm is already in covenant with human petitioners, whether you ink it or not." "You bought petitions with stolen tokens," Kaelin answered. "Stolen work voids claim." "How moral," Aldrin said softly. "How comfortable, for a prince who has never traded a name to pull a fever down in a child at midnight." The wind took the edge off the words, but not their aim. I swallowed, tasted iron and wax, and slipped my needle. Under the first script filament that drifted our way, lift, undo, smooth, the letter fell apart like a knot properly teased. Aldrin shifted tactics. He reached into the satchel and drew out 3 blue ribbons. Even from here, I knew the weave. My mother favored it for strength without bulk. Each ribbon bore the swallow she stitched. So small, so steady. He held them up like trophies. "I do not steal," he said. "I collect what people hand me, because they do not know the price, or do not care. They call it a token, a keepsake, a charm. They bring me knots when they are drowning. I give them rope." He flicked his fingers. The ribbons arced, caught the updraft, and came to our side of the gorge, light as breath. They did not land. They hovered. One dipped toward me. "Do not touch," Kaelin warned. "I wasn't going to," I said, because I knew trapweave when I saw it. My needle hovered. Up close, I saw how Aldrin had made the ribbon speak, not with ink, but with thread pulled from its own body, worry-picked until it thinned into a line, and then braided back into the weave in a pattern that spelled names. Laura, Hannah, Pieter. Maker's mark bent back against itself to betray the maker. My throat burned. Mother never gave these. She sold dresses, Aldrin called, hearing what my face could not hide. She hemmed wedding linens and burial. Shrouds. People tie pieces of hope into ordinary cloth, Elowen. They brought me scraps torn from her work when hope frayed. If anything, your mother gave more than she knew. Kaelin didn't answer the taunt. He knelt, pressed his wounded palm to frost, and drew a door of light waist-high the way he had in the hall. This one faced outward like a shield, its lintel braced on 2 lines scratched in ice. The vow thread in my wrist tightened as if it wanted to bind to the hinge. "If he sends vines," Kaelin said, "step behind the door. If he sends birds, stitch their wings." "What if he sends wolves?" I asked, because fear, raised on farm nights with lambing and lean winters, had a shape. "Then we show them where the cliff ends," he said, and for half a breath I loved him for the practical answer and the way he made the impossible sound like an errand. Aldrin did not send wolves. He sent a falcon made of ledger paper, each feather a column line, and each eye a dark blot where ink had pooled. It stooped without flapping, a neat calculation solving for X across the gorge. I stitched at the seam of its left wing where paper wanted to fold, and made paper do what cloth does when you put in a discreet gather. It wrinkled. The bird yawed. Kalen's door of day took the brunt of its beak. The strike rang like a coin-hit stone. The falcon, shattered into equations and dates, and the names of lambs born under frost. For a heartbeat, the air was full of seasons. Enough. Aldrin's voice flattened. He lifted both hands now, and the parchment at his feet unfurled by itself, then flared. What flowed out was not bramble this time, but handwriting given spine. The long, rolling lines of the winter ledger, the one he read at the well each year. The script lifted like a tide and reached for the ridge where we stood. Kalen didn't move aside. He stepped forward, blade low. "If you bring the well to the cliff," he said evenly, "you admit the court has jurisdiction." "On the contrary," Aldrin said, fingertips bright with ink, "I demonstrate that the court's boundaries are illusions curated by princes who like to own horizons." The tide of names touched the door of day and pressed. The door bowed. My stitches on the glass shard burned, cold hot in my palm. The hem caught more light. Dawn leaned harder. The silver under my skin went taut, a seam on the verge. "Hold," Kalen said. I held. The tide lifted again, seeking a crack. It nosed toward me, tasted the swallow tucked in my pocket as if scent could be spelled. When the first curl of ledger script reached my boot, it tried to write around me the way bramble wraps a sapling. I slipped my needle under the loop and broke it. Not tew. With iron this time, but with grammar. My mother had taught me to splice sentence threads so that they read smooth. I unspliced the loop until it forgot whether it was an O or a 0, or nothing at all. The loop collapsed. Aldrin watched closely now, hawk calm. "You see?" he called to Kalen. "She can do it. She was always going to do it. You didn't choose a witness. The bramble did, years ago, when her mother's work met a prince's courtesy in summer shade." The cliff wind guttered. The world waited for the next line of the old argument. I couldn't bear the way they spoke around me as if I were a hinge, important, but not the door. "If there's a truth you're working so hard not to say," I called back, "spit it and be done." Aldrin's mouth softened. For a flicker, he looked human. Not broker, not teacher, not rival. "Very well," he said. "When you were born, 2 ledgers wrote you. Your mother put a Lowen Greyweave in the human book at the well, and a Moonthorn hand," his eyes flicked to Kalen, "entered a second line in the court's birth roll, with half your older name folded, and a mark beside it that meant foster right. They hid you in plain sight, not fae, not elf, human, and yet under Moonthorn's shadow. The silver thread under my skin pulsed like a struck string. Memory flared, summer shade and a tall boy with a circlet too, big, kneeling to let a toddler tug his braid. My mother's fingers tapping my lips, folding a syllable and tucking it away like a pin. "Foster, right to what end?" Kalen asked, too steady for how his shoulders tightened. "To be the blade that can cut Moonthorn's knot without blood," Aldrin said simply. "To be witness when your house turned its face away from famine, while winter swallowed 3 villages whole." His eyes came back to me. "They made you a tool and called it mercy." My pulse climbed into my mouth. "He is lying," Kalen said, "but there was grief in it, and regret is a kind of truth. The famine was not as he paints. We were bound by the same law you're invoking now," Aldrin said, "which is the point. Vows bind until they choke. I am trying to teach the court how to breathe." Light reached our ledge with a deliberate step. The hem took, hard, the cliff face around us. Brightened not silver, but clear like water. No color, all color. The vow recognized the place it had been promised, and rose inside me like a bell struck at the exact center. The air thickened. A pattern climbed the rock behind us. Leaf vein lines, swallow marks, needle scratches, resolving into an arch that had been there all along and had only waited for the right light to be seen. Beyond it, not distance but depth, a chamber cut into the cliff itself, a dais like a river stone, seats like grown trunks. The court did not arrive so much as decide to become visible. Aldrin's satchel snapped shut by itself. He bowed as if entering a church and lifted his head with a smile sharpened to a plea. "At last," he said, "let the proper ink be poured." He looked from Kalen to me. I petitioned judgment. The vow thread in my wrist burned cool, then quieted. "Ready. Witness," Kalen said softly. And this time when the word settled on me, it was not a shield against a thief's syllables. It was a key in a lock. "Walk with me." We stepped through the arch as the cliff finished remembering it was a door. The The world beyond smelled of river and old leaf and paper left in sunlight. Every seat was empty. Every eye was watching. The chamber inside the cliff was not built. It had been persuaded. Stone rose in ribs like the underside of a leaf. The river spoke through the walls in a steady breath. When my boot touched the floor, light collected around my wrist where the silver vow thread ran, as if the room were looking there first. A voice answered our footfalls without showing a mouth. "Petition entered," it said, layered like rain on slate. "Prince Kaelin of Moonthorn standing. Aldrin, scribe of the border wells, standing. Witness, named and unnamed. Present, named and unnamed." The old ember behind my teeth flared and steadied. Kaelin bowed, not courtly flourish, but the bow of someone who respects a knife he has to use. Aldrin inclined his head as if greeting a favorite line in a ledger. The dais at the chamber's heart widened, and on it appeared 3 objects that were not there, then were: a shallow basin of water dark as ink, a long flat stone scarred with faint grooves like old cut marks, and a spool carved from clear wood with no grain. The basin was for seeing, the stone was for severing. The spool, my hands knew it before my mind framed the word, was for holding what might otherwise run. "The law of witness is simple," the chamber said. "One truth spoken by the named witness shall anchor judgment. Before this, the petitioners may lay their proofs. After this, the cutting or the binding will follow." Aldrin looked pleased, as if a recipe were proceeding on schedule. "I asked to lay first," he said. "Denied," the chamber replied with the calm of bedrock. "The one who invoked dawn against itself presents first, that the motive of haste be weighed." Kaelin's mouth tightened. He nodded. He did not reach for rhetorical drums. He turned his left palm, showing the welt where Thistle had kissed him through leather, the bruise blacker now than dusk. "Winter bramble blooms," he said, "where no frost flower should show. Someone is feeding it with human names, and he has braided those names into thorn shapes that pass for help. I cut a white this morning, formed around a ledger of petitions. We found this inside its knot." He laid my mother's blue ribbon on the stone the way a careful hand lays a sleeping child, not to wake it, and not to abandon it. The swallow was smudged almost to wingless. I took out the scrap of parchment tucked into the hem and set it beside. The ribbon, Elowen Greyweave, held for third dawn. The basin inhaled light. Ripples formed into letters I could not read, and then into images I could. Hands, many, passing ribbons, scraps, lockets, buttons over a table. A neat thumb pressing each into a book's gutter, a knife nicking a thread to make it speak. A winter night where a fever broke because a name burned like tallow in a bramble crown. "I do not deny outcomes," Kaelin said, and that cost him something. I heard it. But the price was not consented to with knowledge, and the broker bound the payments to a hedge that eats what it is fed, and then opens its mouth for more. If the court tolerates this, the border will turn into a field of clever graves. The chamber went very quiet. "Laid," it said. "Broker, your proofs." Aldrin approached the basin as if dipping a pen. He did not flinch at the ribbon on the stone. His gaze brushed it and moved on. The way a man skims entries he believes he has already accounted for. "Hungry winters teach ugly lessons," he said. "The court offers oaths and limits. The hedge offers immediacy. People brought me tokens saturated with hope. I matched hope to hungry root, and took thorns into my own hands so that children wouldn't. That the hedge asks for names is not theft when the names are offered." He lifted his inked thumbs. The basin dutifully showed a lambing hut where wolves circled and then veered away. A well that refilled overnight. A grave left undug because a breath steadied and stayed. It also showed a woman in a doorway, gray with worry, tearing the swallow from a hem. I made myself look. I made myself watch the moment her mouth hardened into a choice. "Prices were explained," Aldrin said softly. "They would not have been understood if I had spoken in elf law. I spoke in hunger and frost. That is a dialect humans comprehend." I felt Kaelin's glance like a hand I could choose not to take. I kept my eyes on the basin. "Laid," the chamber said again. "Witness." The word landed in me with a weight and a rightness that made my breath catch. The silver thread warmed, not tugging, not pushing, only ready. This was the place the vow had pointed since morning. This was the stitch it wanted. I could have said 100 things. My mind laid them out like garments on a table. The white's borrowed voice at the ridge, the blue ribbon cut from my mother's work, Aldrin's neat thumbs, Kaelin's flinch when famine was named. The law would hold only one. I put my fingers on the clear spool to steady them. The wood took my heat and gave none back. "Truth," I said, and my voice didn't tremble. My mother's mark is not currency. It is a maker's oath that a garment will not fall apart when strain comes. Aldrin used that mark to mint tokens she did not consent to be coin. He unpicked the trust in every stitch she set and sold it to a hedge. That is counterfeiting hope. The chamber did not answer with words at first. The ribbon on the stone lifted as if a swallow remembered how to fly. Blue thread unwove itself from the false braid and coiled away from the parchment like a child pulling back from a stove. On the basin, images stuttered. In each, the swallow appeared, pecked at the knot where name met thorn, and the knot loosened. Witness truth accepted, the chamber said at last, voice deeper. Mark binding is sacred. To counterfeit it is a breach of both books. The names traded under counterfeit marks shall be unwound and returned. The hedge's claims attached to those marks are void. Aldrin did not shout. He merely blinked, as if a sum had come. Outwrong in a way he had never seen. And the debts? He asked, soft. The help that was given. The wolves turned. The fever cooled. You return names, very pretty, very righteous. But who pays the balance owed to winter, if not the hedge that did the labor? Will you? Will Moonthorn? Or will children learn that aid is always a test and usually a lie? The chamber's silence shifted. I felt the river in the walls change its song by a note. Judgment requires balance, it said. Returned names leave a weight. That weight seeks the nearest ledger that benefited. Aldrin smiled a little then, quick as a knife. Nearest, he repeated. His eyes flicked to Kalen's welted hand. I understood before Kalen spoke. My stomach went cold and then burned. If the hedge's claims were voided where they touched counterfeited marks, the hunger of the magic would not evaporate. It would reroute. It would seek the closest oath-bound vessel, the prince who had cut the thistle away, who had invoked the court, who had walked with me under witness. It would take the pain from the lambing huts and the fevers and lay it into him root by root until the ledger was clean. Kalen did not look away from the basin when he said, very calmly, I will take it. Of course you will. Aldrin murmured, you were raised on edges. Hold, the chamber said, and now it was iron. A cut has not been offered. The cut is mine to offer, Kalen replied. He placed his wounded palm on the scarred stone. By the bough that bears my house and the star that marks my line, I will carry what the hedge fed on counterfeit marks. The debt will sit in my body until it can be translated into something that heals without names. That will kill you, I said, and only realized I had said it aloud when the chamber made my breath echo. He did not flinch. It may, he allowed, but it will not kill a village. I looked at Aldrin. He did not look back. His gaze was on the spool under my hand, calculating again. He had made peace with Kalen's death in the space of a blink, and was already moving columns in his head. Wait. The word came out of me like a stitch that snags and saves a seam. There is a third way. Both of them turned. The chamber listened. You taught me to hem dawn, I said to Kalen. You anchored a door in Underleaf and made the room obey the shape. We can make a fold here, not a lie, a bias. We can run the weight into the selvage the hall keeps for war. It's an edge designed to bear pull. The debt doesn't vanish. It holds in the fabric rather than in flesh until it can be paid in provisions, in grain, in work, translated clean, counted openly, not in blood. Without names, the chamber said, considering, and without hedge. Without hedge, I repeated. Use my witness thread. Use the spool. Bind the weight into the edge until Moonthorn makes right in market and field. Aldrin laughed once, not kindly. You trust princes to settle ledgers? No, I said. I trust the whole room to hold them to it. You wanted a ledger everyone could see. This is it. Kalen's eyes had gone very still, not empty, clear. He lifted his hand from the stone and flexed his fingers as if feeling for a new tool. We can do this, he said to the chamber. Not question, blueprint. We can let the edge carry without tearing the cloth. Terms, the chamber said, which in Moonthorn means hope is real enough to price. I spoke before fear could talk me out of my own idea. My vow ends clean when the fold is tied, I said. No loopholes, no third dawn awaiting me in a hedge. The court publishes the weight and the schedule of its translation. Moonthorn signs in blood and bread. The border wells sign with water and grain. Aldrin, I forced myself to face him. You are bound from touching a mark that is not your own. Your ink will not write on anything that bears a maker's oath you didn't craft. Aldrin's mouth tightened for the first time. You would cut my hands. I would stop you from stealing other people's fingers, I said. The river and the walls. Changed song again. Higher, keener. The chamber spoke like a loom catching rhythm. Accepted, if the cut holds. The cut holds, Kaelin said, taking up the knife and setting its flat against the ribbon. The blade drank light. Witness, will you sew the fold? I set the clear spool on the stone. It hummed. The silver thread under my skin rose to meet it like a river meeting sea. I drew the thread. No, not drew. I invited, and it came willingly, a line of quick light running from wrist to spool, spool to stone, stone to basin. The chamber made room for it the way a shirt makes room for a new seam when you know where to give. I set the needle and began. Outside the cliff, something stirred, distant as weather and close as breath. The winter thistles were moving. The hedge did not like being written out of the last line of its favorite story. Faster, Kaelin said quietly, and not to hurry. Me, only to name the speed the world was choosing. I stitched on the bias, as I had learned to do on tricky cloth, not with the grain, not against it, but across, where give lives. With each stitch the weight lifted from the ribbon and slid along the thread to the spool, humming deep, not fighting, heavy, yes, but willing to be held if you told it how. A crack like ice underfoot ran through the air behind us. The arch shivered. Underleaf leaned in, smelling of ash and rain. The hedge arrived as a pressure against the door we had made of dawn, finding its own third dawn and pressing it like a bruise. Last stitch, I said, breath tight. Make it clean, the chamber said. I pinched the thread, turned the knot in the air, and pulled. The knot vanished into the bias like a swallow into blue. The spool took the weight and sang the low note of a beam that will not break even when the storm pushes. The ribbon on the stone went slack, only cloth again. In my wrist, the silver cooled to the temperature of my skin, and then dimmed, not gone, only quiet, as if it had finally sat down. Cut, the chamber commanded. Kaelin brought the moonlight blade down. The sound was not steel on stone. It was a heartbeat settling after a run. The vow thread in me parted without pain. From the threshold, 100 tiny voices hissed in disappointment and withdrew. The hedge had been denied its mouth. It slid away, hungry and thwarted. Aldrin's satchel buckled inward as if it had swallowed a stone. He lifted ink-stained hands and looked at his thumbs, as if seeing them for the first time. His smile was still clever. It had lost its certainty. Balanced, the chamber said. Names returned. Weight held. Publication in 3 bells. The law had closed like a book, but the story was not finished. Endings never are. Aldrin inclined his head to me. You sew beautifully, he said. What will you do when princes tire of feeding ledgers with bread instead of blood? Keep sewing, I answered, and was surprised by the steadiness in it. He stepped backward, and Underleaf swallowed him. The sound it made was not a door closing. It was a page turning. Kaelin set the knife down and looked at me, as if only now permitted to. The welt on his palm had not faded, but its color had changed. Less bruise, more old wine. He exhaled. You spoke your one truth, he said, almost wonderingly. You freed more than yourself, and tied more than I meant to, I said, touching the spool with 2 fingers. The weight it held was real, but it did not feel malevolent. It felt like winter grain in a bin, heavy, necessary, named. Come, the chamber said gently. The river has other business. We stepped back, through the arch as light did what light always does when invited properly. It went where it belonged. Outside, the cliff was a cliff again, and the river was river, and frost glittered like 1,000 tiny needles that had learned, at last, not to bite. 3 bells after the cliff remembered it was a door. The announcement moved like weather. You could not point to it, but you knew when it crossed your skin. A cooling, a brightening, the peculiar hush of a room about to hear its name read aloud. In the square by the well, letters lifted from water like minnows, and arranged themselves on the surface, steady as signs carved in oak. Farmers, shepherds, my mother, Mira Greyweave, jaw set and apron damp from rinsed thread, watched as the court published what the chamber had promised, the weight we had bound to the selvage, the work that would translate it, the schedule that would pay it down in flour, in timber, in roofs that didn't leak. No thistles, no names offered like coins you could spend only once. The grain house must move its ledger to the long table, Mira said quietly, more to herself than to anyone in particular. Not behind the counter, where hands can see. That is in the line, I murmured, because I had memorized the list while the river wrote it. Open column. Witness signature from the wells at first. Delivery. Moonthorn countersigns at each 7th. She glanced at me, the way a mother does when her child says something adult-shaped for the first time. Moonthorn signs with what? Ink? Bread, I said. And bodies, if need be. I didn't mean death. I meant hands lifting beams, boots walking muddy ruts to bring wood to houses with more draft than door. Kaelin had argued for that clause until the chamber set a groove in the stone to remind itself. Witnesses learn fast. Princes who want to keep promises learn faster. Kaelin stood a little apart, not aloof, visible. The welt on his palm had faded from bruise to wine, the way a stain works itself into cloth not as damage but as history. He did not draw attention to himself. He did not hide. When a shepherd with chapped knuckles approached and held out a ribbon, blue, swallow neatly stitched, Kaelin lifted both hands, palms empty. "Keep it," he said, and inclined his head to the ribbon instead of the man. "Your mark is your oath. No one else writes on it now." The shepherd swallowed, nodded once, and tucked his scrap back into his cap, like a charm reclaimed from a fire. I carried the clear spool bound to my satchel with a strap my mother had made when I was 10. It hummed with stored debt the way a granary hums in winter. Quietly, constantly, the sound of a thing doing the job it was shaped for. People could feel it when they stood near me. They stood near me anyway. Grief makes you brave. So does the sight of your name not written under thorns. Aldrin did not come to the square. He could not write on our marks now. The chamber had cut that trick out of his hands. But absence makes its own noise. Some looked toward the lane that led under ash, and frowned as if a draft had found the back of their necks. "Foster Wright," Mira said to me later, when the well's letters dissolved, and the square filled with ordinary talk again. We stood in the doorway of our shop, where the light knew every nick in the counter, and every place the floor creaked. "You heard it in the cliff. You want to ask why I folded your older syllable, and put you to bed with a human lullaby. I want to hear what you call the truth of it," I said, surprising myself with the gentleness in my own voice. I had rehearsed anger for years without knowing it. It collapsed like paper when faced with my mother's hands, raw from rinsing wool. She wiped those hands on her apron and didn't meet my eyes. "Your father died during the cold spring," she said. "You know that. You do not know that the year before, the court sent a boy guest to study our work. He was polite and lonely and careful with needles. He spilled ink on his sleeve and apologized. To the sleeve, you tugged his braid and he let you. He told me a thing with the seriousness only children manage, that a ledger could be made from kindness if someone would write it down loud enough. He asked me to mark the hems of women I trusted, so the court would learn the weight of work." She half laughed, half winced. "So I did. So we did. Kaelin," I said, and the room let the name sit without knocking any plates off the shelf. "He came. Back the spring your father took sick," she went on. "He read to me in the doorway, names of lambs born and babies named and roofs patched, and he kept stopping to listen to the way the village said yes and not yet and please. He asked what your older syllable meant when you shouted your own name into the well bucket. I told him it meant more than the bucket had room for." Mira finally looked at me. "He said the court could hold the spill if I wanted." I said yes, because I thought kindness written down would save you later. I did not see the shadow it cast. "The shadow became Aldrin," I said. "I did not forgive her. I did not need to. Forgiveness is a later verb, but I understood, and understanding is a stitch stronger than blame." We heard the bells again at second sundown, 3 low notes rolling from the river bone and carrying up every lane. Publication, the court had promised. It was not merely lists and schedules. It was visibility. The second set of letters rose, and every child in the square pointed at the novelty of words floating where only buckets had right to be. The notice was short. Shortages, time, labor needed, and one more line that stiffened the air, as if someone had pulled 2 corners of the sky and made it taut. Broker petitions redirected, names returned, witnesses needed to undo old knots. "They'll come," Kaelin said at my shoulder, steady as if naming the dawn. "Men who paid with a button they kept from their mother's coat, women who tore ribbon from a christening blanket. They will want to see their names come back out of the hedge." "How do we do that without growing thistle?" I asked. "With needles," he said simply, and the shape of it filled me with a tired, fierce joy. "With yours, with Mira's, with every woman who learned to make a hemhold." When a body leaned against it in grief, we unpick the false braids and rebind the real ones. No shortcuts, no magic that bites. He looked at my mother then and bowed, not as a prince to a subject, but as a student to a master. "Will you teach my hands not to insult the cloth?" Mira's mouth trembled in a way I had only ever seen when lightning struck near during lambing, and she counted us all without moving her lips. "Bring a chair," she said, briskly, "and do not lean your weight on the counter. It has stood longer than most princes." He took the chair. He did not lean. He learned. The light slid down the window and made a ladder on the wall, step by step. His big hands found small rhythm. He pricked his finger once, swore in an apologetic whisper, and grinned at the blood as if relieved to discover he still had some left to give. People began to come before the lamps were lit. A girl, with a braid too tight, brought a strip of her grandmother's pillowcase. A boy I'd patched trousers for unrolled a string tied around a button the size of my thumbnail. A woman I had never seen walked straight from the well to our counter and laid down a bit of hand-woven red with a broken selvage. None of them said Aldrin. All of them said, in their own dialects, "Please." We made the shop into a hall again. We set a basin of warm water on the table and washed each token first, the way a midwife washes her hands before she lifts a life. Then we looked for the telltale. Thread pulled thin until it changed job from cloth to word. We unpicked it where it crossed a maker's oath, and when the last strand let go, the spool at my hip hummed and lightened. Grain shifting in an invisible bin, names loosened, breath steadied, shoulders dropped. No one cheered. Work is not a theater. It is better. At full dark, a shadow filled the doorway without crossing it. I knew the shape before my eyes caught up. The satchel was missing. The neatness was not. Aldrin stood in the threshold with his hands visible, thumbs inked and stilled. "I came to see if your sewing holds," he said to my mother, because he knew where the dignity in the room lived. Mira lifted her chin and threaded a needle without looking down. "It holds," she said, "and it will hold when you are an old story told to frighten apprentices who think cleverness is a substitute for care." He took the scolding like a man recognizing a familiar net. "And you?" he asked me. "Will you keep binding the edge when your prince's shoulders tire?" "Until the ledger reads 0, I said. "And after, because there is always another winter." He nodded, something like respect passing between us that wasn't forgiveness and didn't need to be. He could not step inside. Underleaf had taken that courtesy away. He stepped back into the night and let the door do the speaking for him. When the last token had been unpicked and the lamps were turned down to embers, Kalen leaned his elbows on his knees and looked at me as if weary was finally permitted. "Your older syllable," he said carefully, "is still yours. Keep calling me Elowen," I said. "If the other is a key, we do not use it. Unless we must. I like the door we opened today better than the ones that open when you shout in a hedge." He smiled with his eyes more than his mouth. "Elowen, then." We walked to the square once more before sleep. The well was a mirror without letters. The sky wore a thin scatter of cold stars. I reached for his hand and turned it palm up. The welt had softened to a pale crescent. I ran my thumb along it, the way my mother had taught me to. Smooth a seam, and he did not pull away. "Tomorrow," he said, not a promise this time, but a simple fact. "We carry the spool to the weaver's hall and bind it to the selvage where war keeps its edge. Then I go to Moonthorn to nail the schedule to the council's door until every elder has splinters. And I come with you," I said, surprising myself less than him. "You are free of the vow," he replied, not warning, only naming. "I am," I said, "and I am staying because I choose. The court should hear a witness who can sew two truths together without lying. Besides," I tipped my head toward the river, which had decided to sound like a loom again. "If you are going to hammer a schedule to a door, someone should mind your nails." He laughed quietly. Relief and something warmer braided through it. The sound felt like a room with a fire lit, and the door cracked for cold air to learn its manners. We stood there until our breath turned to mist and then thinned. Tomorrow was working its way toward us. Dawn, I knew now, was obedient when you gave it shape. So was love, perhaps, if you taught it gently and did not rush the hem. At first light, we carried the clear spool back to the weaver's hall, just as we'd promised the chamber. The air still smelled of ash and rain. Underleaf kept its counsel, a good neighbor who minded its own hedges. Mira walked with us, sleeves pinned high, a coil of waxed thread looped around her wrist like a bracelet you couldn't buy, only earn by practicing until your fingers believed you. The door greeted her palm with the satisfaction of old wood recognizing a hand that had never lied to it. We set the spool on the long table where generations had braided thatch and mended sails. It made a sound when the grain of oak met the grainless clarity of its carved body, a faint chord like a loom striking true. Kalen drew a chalk line down the center of the table and marked the four corners with rowan ash, then looked to me. This time there was no spell in the looking, only trust. "Bind it to the selvage," he said softly. "Make the edge stronger than the cloth." I threaded my needle and breathed into the new morning. No bramble sang, no ledger hissed. The silver under my skin lay quiet, a scar of moonlight. Turned domestic. I stitched the bias fold we'd taught the world on the cliff, and the hall took it in without fuss, the way a good hem disappears until weight tests it. When I set the last knot, the spool settled, humming like a granary full enough to sleep near. If anyone brought counterfeit marks to this table now, the edge would refuse them the way a wise host refuses a guest who will not wash his hands. Mira pressed her thumbprint into wax and set it on the table's corner. Kalen did the same with his signet. He had traded circlet for citizen's seal this morning, a simple stamp of the Moonthorn leaf. "Bread and bodies," he repeated, more to himself than to us, as if turning the promise over to check for cracks. We took the pledge to Moonthorn before noon. The path up the eastern bow was all shadowed terraces and steps cut into living trunk. Kalen warned me it might feel like walking inside a decision made centuries ago, and he was right. Everything in that place had been agreed to before I was born, but the door he made on the cliff had taught me something. Agreements that help can be added. You do not always have to tear down a house to put in a window. The council chamber opened like a hollow ringed by living ribs, cousins to the river bone that had listened to us at the gorge. Elders stood in a crescent. Some had bark-thick skin and eyes old as stormwood. Some were younger and wore politics like a second cloak. Kalen did not bow so low that he forgot the spine he'd been given. He placed a copy of the published schedule on the rail, tacked it down with 4 iron nails, and read it aloud. Every clause, every seventh, every place where the ledger would be seen by hands as well as eyes. When he finished, an elder with needles of white hair said, "You pulled the hedge's teeth and offered the court your throat. Bold boy. Fools and heroes share a road." "True," Kalen said, "but my throat is not alone. The village stands with us. The Weaver's Hall has bound the edge. If we starve together. If we eat because we learned to share weight before winter insists on it." Another elder, a woman with leaf vein lines at the corners of her mouth, studied me without blinking. "The witness who sowed dawn," she said. "Your mother's oath sits on our table now." She rapped her knuckles on the schedule. "Will you bind when my colleagues forget this paper has teeth?" "I will remind," I said, loudly. The room tried to make me afraid. I let it. Fear is a seam. You can take it in until the garment fits. They voted by laying their hands on the schedule and letting it take their warmth. One by one, reluctant and willing, proud and convinced. They added heat to the ink until the letters glowed like truth caught at last. When the last hand lifted, the page was not a page anymore. It was a promise the wood itself had learned to remember. Kalen stepped back and did not smile. Relief and resolve braided equally in his face. We came down the bow to find the square already at work. The first carts of timbers had arrived from the north ridge. The miller's boy had chalk on his cheek where he'd written deliveries on a slate anyone could correct. Mira had 3 girls at the long table learning to unpick counterfeit braids without tearing the real weave underneath. A baby slept on a folded cloak, breathing in the slow, sainted rhythm of small animals and people who have never met the word ledger, and yet are its purpose. Aldrin stood at the edge of the crowd, hands bare. The ink on his thumbs had faded to a gray stain, like an old decision you can't wash out, but can choose not to repeat. He caught my eye and tipped his head, not asking to cross the threshold that would not welcome him. "Underleaf took my right to write on others' marks," he said. "It did not take my memory. If you need a voice to read totals where the wind carries sound, I have one. Come at dusk," I said. "Stand at the well. Speak only what is written, and let the water correct you if you wonder." He winced at that, and then nodded. "Fair." Kalen kept his distance from that exchange, letting me name my own edges. When I turned back to him, he had set his sword aside and was carrying a beam on his shoulder, like any other worker grateful to be told where to put his strength. The welt on his palm had softened from old wine to shadow. I took his free hand and helped guide the beam to its new home. The building accepted it with a shiver that felt like relief. We worked until evening taught the river to sing low. Then we lit lamps and gathered by the well. Children sat on the stones. Women leaned elbows on their knees the way they do when they're ready to listen and judge. Men stood with caps in hand and straw at their boots. Aldrin read the first tally in a clear voice. Grain delivered, roofs patched, debts translated into wood stacked under dry rafters. No hedge, no thorns, only numbers. You could see and argue with until they behaved. When the reading ended, Kalen lifted his hand but not his rank. This morning, I asked you to trust a prince's promise, he said. Tonight, I ask you to trust your own. He pointed to the long table where the spool hummed, steady as sleeping bread. Bring your tokens. Bring your work. When winter rattles our doors, it will find them latched and our names unbent. People began to disperse, softened, by the kind of tired that comes from moving the world one finger's width. Mira kissed my temple and went inside to count needles and hide the good chocolate from children who had already learned to scale shelves like ladders. Aldrin stepped into Underleaf without flourish and let the corridor take him. The river made a promise to tomorrow and filed it where rivers file such things. Kaelin and I stayed by the well until the square was ours alone. Stars opened like eyelets in a midnight bodice. He turned his palm up. I laid my thread scar across his lifeline and felt the echo of a vow that had ended clean make room for one that didn't need magic to hold. You are free, he said again, but there was a question curled under it now. Do you choose? I choose, I answered. Not the hedge's hunger or the old law's laziness. I choose you and work and a door that answers when we knock. I took his signet, turned it between forefinger and thumb, then pressed it back into his palm. Bind me by vow, I said, smiling at my own audacity, but do it the way my mother would, with a stitch that can be unpicked if it stops fitting, and remade larger when our lives ask for more room. He laughed with his whole mouth this time, relief and wonder, and the first slyness of a joy that was going to outlive winter. Elowen Greyweave, he said, and there was no power in it, except the kind that comes from speaking a name with care. I vow to carry my part of the beam, to count my pride like grain and keep it below the rim, to make doors where you point, and leave them open when you say. And I said, borrowing the shape of the chamber's cadence without its iron, vow to keep the edge strong, to say the hard truth before it turns cruel, and to thread my life through yours without tangling. Your hands, we touched foreheads, no light, no law, just breath shared over water that knew all the old stories and agreed to keep this new one too. In the distance, a fox barked twice as if counting something it had finally remembered. The well gave back our shapes in the lamp's faint halo, a woman with a needle, a prince without a crown, both of us learning to be smaller and therefore strong. The thistles did bloom again, but when they did, they stayed purple and honest, too wary of a village that had learned to love its own marks to try counterfeiting them. And when winter pressed, the selvage held. It will hold the next winter, and the one after, because the edge is our work now, not a vow's leash, but a line we keep together, turning cloth into shelter, names into bread, and dawn into the hour you can choose.